Test, test.
Need a microphone.
There we go. Test, 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 test.
Oh, okay. So it's ready? Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Karen Hesley, and I am part of the Foundation's work here on the East End and at the West End of the Valley at Oak Grove School. I'm very happy to welcome you all today, this afternoon, on this drizzly, wonderful day. And a special welcome to Mary and to Larry, Verschuur. He said, that's how you can remember how to say the name, Verschuur. So we are especially grateful that Larry and Mary are here again to visit us, starting with a gift. I'd like to just recollect a story of how things happen. And here are Larry and Mary in Ojai. And so the long story is Mary started and grew up in Scotland, ended up in Chicago, because somebody mentioned a Montessori teaching training session. So she enrolled in that class in Chicago, became certified, met Larry in Chicago, and somebody happened to mention that they were starting a school in Omaha. So they ended up starting a school in Omaha in the year 1967. And that's what they've been doing all this time until 2015, when they decided to close the school. And being a nonprofit, they needed to find a place to give the money after the sale of the buildings. So Larry had been out to Ojai to attend an education conference here, and Oak Grove became the beneficiaries of their gift. So but the connections between Montessori and Krishnamurti are deep, and I really look forward to hearing about them from Mary. And just a couple notes also about Montessori from Oak Grove School decades. Many of the Oak Grove teachers have had Montessori training and have deeply, deeply respected and honored Montessori's work. And there have been other alternative educators who the school has drawn on for all of its life. Rudolf Steiner, of course, and John Holt, and the more recent Essential School movement. There's just so many alternative, trying to shake up the system a bit into some sanity. So it's a deep connection between Montessori and Krishnamurti. And can you imagine that in the 1960s, Montessori training or schools did not exist in this country? That's how current it is. It's pretty incredible to think that now there are thousands and thousands of schools across the world and several thousand in this country. So the need for that kind of education was apparent. And so I look forward to hearing what you have to say, Mary, and welcome and thank you again for coming. And I'll turn it over to you now. Okay.
Thank you, Karen, for that introduction. I'd like to say hello and welcome to my talk. It is a talk rather than a dialogue. I hope you can appreciate that. And I would like to ask that you hold any questions or discussion until I finish my presentation. I'm a Montessori teacher or a guide by training and profession. I'm a history buff by avocation. My degree is in 16th century Scottish history, but I learned through my exploration of that time period the value of research and the insights that it could provide. I came to the work of Krishnamurti through my husband, who began reading his work long before I did. However, it was while visiting the Oak Grove School a few years ago that I was prompted to look at Krishnamurti's educational philosophy. And I discovered some striking parallels between what he had to say and the work of Maria Montessori. And so I begin to inquire more deeply into those similarities. I could have selected from any number of topics to isolate for this presentation. However, the creation of a peaceful environment as the foundation for education at all levels encompasses many of the aspects of right education that are common to both Krishnamurti and Montessori. And that will be the theme of my presentation here today. I think as individuals, we look at war and conflict, disaster and despair, and we usually feel quite helpless. There seems to be little that one person can do to prevent war, to halt bigotry, or to alleviate nationalistic conflicts. Governments, religious groups, states, and international organizations work together and separately to bring about a more peaceful world. Yet for all their efforts, conflict seems to escalate rather than to diminish. Are there any possible pathways to peace? And do the philosophies of J. Krishnamurti and Maria Montessori that underlie the schools bearing their names have anything to share in addressing this question? Neither Krishnamurti nor Montessori was schooled as an educator. Krishnamurti was a philosopher and a mystic. Maria Montessori was a physician and an anthropologist by training. But from these divergent disciplines, each came to recognize an urgent need for peace in our society, and each came to grasp the significance of education as the means by which the necessary regeneration of society might be accomplished. Each envisioned a new educational approach that would lead to the creation of what Montessori called a new world for a new man, and what Krishnamurti said might result in a new social order and enduring peace. Schools bearing the names of Montessori and Krishnamurti, in which their respective teachings are practiced, have been established worldwide. At first glance, these schools might appear to have little in common. However, as I said, the study of the fundamental principles advocated by both Krishnamurti and Montessori reveals that they had many of the same insights when they came to discuss the values of what Montessori called our schools, or what Krishnamurti referred to as right education. And most importantly for this presentation, both addressed the issue of pathways to peace through education. So I'd like to look first a little bit at the topic of peace and education. Krishnamurti and Montessori both used the term regeneration when they spoke of how a peaceful society might possibly come into existence. Both acknowledged that this regeneration involved transformation, and that it would come about only if each of us as individuals was willing to transform him or herself. For as Maria Montessori informed a London audience in 1934, only man who has transformed himself will be capable of forming a different society. How similar are these words to those of Krishnamurti, who told an audience 14 years later, quote, "You, the individual, must realize that by your own transformation, you can bring peace to the world. Your own transformation is of the utmost importance." Close quote. I think it's extremely interesting that both of them used these terms, transformation and regeneration, when they talked about approaching a new approach to education. They're also in agreement, very much so, as to the causes of conflict and war in our society. They identify nationalism, religious intolerance, patriotism, class and race consciousness, all of them as the instigators of separateness, differentiation, and consequently often antagonism. Any of these ideals, and I put the ideals in quotation marks, if you have read Krishnamurti, you know what I'm talking about, can indeed become causes of war. Likewise, neither had any faith in the educational systems of their own times, which each viewed as having failed to bring about a peaceful society. Traditional systems, as seen by both, made it, in the words of Krishnamurti, all too obvious that wars cannot be prevented by education of this kind. Krishnamurti and Montessori both realized that hatred, nationalism, and discrimination in the hearts of men have to be taught to young people. Children are not born patriotic or race or class conscious. Inside their skins, they are all alike. And as Montessori observed in her work with children, their patterns of psychic and physical development are also very universally similar. Consequently, the problem of bringing peace to society has to begin not with the child, but with the transformation of the adults who parent and teach children from a very young age onwards. First then, let's look at the role of the adult. Inner transformation and spiritual preparation were specific terms coined by Krishnamurti and Montessori respectively to describe the essential preparation that the adult must undergo in order to establish a positive, non-harmful relationship with the students or the children in his or her care. Inner transformation, just to repeat, spiritual preparation. The inner preparation involves a deep understanding of the fact that as human beings, each one of us is conditioned by the society and the culture into which we have been born and by which we have been educated. Culture and society impart values and ideals. Without our knowing it, these very often become our own and rest often deep within the subconscious. It is these conditionings that must be confronted before the adult or the teacher can enter into a healthy relationship with the children and the students. In discussing the importance of knowing oneself, Krishnamurti noted that the inner person has to transform himself before he or she can transform society. In order to overcome the hurdle of conditioning, the individual must commit to his own inner transformation. Unless teachers understand competitiveness, acquisitiveness, their belief in rewards and punishments, dependence on authority, if they don't understand those in themselves, they will be unable to help others to achieve freedom from these conditioned states. Self-knowledge involves asking difficult questions and becoming aware of one's habits and beliefs. Acknowledging the possible seeds of prejudice in oneself is not something that can be taught. Krishnamurti often said that becoming aware is not trying to change or to become someone better or someone different, but it does require constant attention to one's thoughts, actions, and reactions. And these come into focus when one is aware and attentive. Recognizing and understanding that we are conditioned frees teachers and others to be alert to the potential harm of imposing their specific conditioning on the children they encounter. Krishnamurti noted more than once that we adults are never concerned deeply enough with the issue of inner transformation. we tend to remain inwardly the same and to be oblivious to, or at least careless about, how we think and act. We do not always stop to consider the impact of what we are teaching by our failure to pay close attention to what we think, believe in, say, and do in shaping the child's environment. Montessori too embraced the theme of self-knowledge, especially in her later works, published after her long sojourn in India. I might mention here that Maria Montessori was the guest of the Arundels at the Theosophical Society in Adyar for the duration of the Second World War. She was interned as a paranational in India in 1939 and remained there till the end of the war and lived on the compounds of the Theosophical Society. And I found that another interesting link between Montessori and Krishnamurti, that the same area had touched both of them in their work. In her later works, The Absorbent Mind and The Formation of Man, both of which resulted from her stay in India, she worked on those themes for those two books while she was there. She suggested that the real preparation for any adult in a teaching role is self-study and preparation of the spirit. I mean, how similar is that to the work of Krishnamurti? Again, she laments in the Formation of Man the many adult prejudices and destructive tendencies requiring attention in anyone concerned with bringing about education for a new world. She recommends that these prejudices must be recognized and abandoned so that the adults can acquire new attitudes that will aid rather than hinder a child's development. I think there's consensus here between Krishnamurti and Montessori that it is necessary to dig deeply into the habit of self-knowledge and into the implications of the separateness engendered by our everyday biases and beliefs. As adults in the children's world, I think we're all too often encumbered by our own conditioning. We want to help. We want the children to know our version of the truth. So in other words, it is often all too easy to pass on our conditioning without being even aware of it, and thus to, I say, entangle the child rather than to free him. Overall, when discussing the role of the adult, I think Krishnamurti places greater emphasis on the adult's conditioning and the need to overcome it, while Montessori ascribes greater importance to the grown-up person's following the child and nurturing development. However, both would agree that to follow development and to understand each student without trying to mold that child into someone he or she, society, thinks or says that he or she ought to be, requires great skill on the part of the educator. Beyond self-knowledge and abandoning one's prejudices, teachers must engage in careful observation. They must be aware of the importance of focused attention, and they must allow discovery on the part of the student. Besides self-preparation and the preparation, both advocated the preparation of a suitable environment for learning as being the remit of the adult in the child's world. Krishnamurti and Montessori agreed that both the outdoor and the indoor environments require attention to ensure optimal opportunities for development, for growth, and learning. And while both extol beauty in the school's surroundings, Montessori is, I think, on the whole, more specific in defining what a suitable environment that corresponds to children's needs at each stage of development. I would say she's the better guide in preparing that environment. I'd like to look now at the issue of freedom. There are many subjects about which Krishnamurti and Maria Montessori talked and wrote when they addressed education. They have much to say in common about observation, about discovery, about attention, love, so forth. However, in the time available for this presentation, freedom is an issue that tends to be a contentious one when it is juxtaposed with education. So I'd like to turn my attention to my protagonist's philosophies regarding the relationship between freedom, peace, and education. Krishnamurti wrote, education, quote, education in the true sense is helping the individual to be mature and free, close quote. Maria Montessori wrote that freedom in education means, quote, freedom for the creative energy, which is the urge of life towards development of the individual, close quote. Clearly, both saw individual freedom as an essential cornerstone of education. As you well know, Krishnamurti wrote extensively on the subject of freedom, and in a much wider context. In this paper, I'm going to limit my discussion to what he has to say about freedom relative to education. I think basic to Krishnamurti's understanding of freedom is the concept of self-knowledge, which we've already talked about. And it's self-knowledge, he argues, that frees a person. The teacher's task then is to help the children or the students to achieve freedom within themselves through giving up their known or their old selves so that each one can learn to recognize his or her conditioning. Krishnamurti provides few guidelines as to how one achieves freedom in education, and I would certainly recommend to you the chapter entitled Right Education in his work on education for some excellent insight. He doesn't elaborate a lot on what is necessary to create the right conditions, how to prepare an environment that allows for exploration, questioning, and discovery, coupled with order, simplicity, and beauty. But he does address or mention all these as component parts of a suitable environment, and he does concede that it is necessary to begin with a young child. Maria Montessori always stressed that her knowledge and understanding of children came from her observations of their growth and development. She didn't come up with ideas and then impose them on the children, but rather she observed and noted, as might a scientist, that from a very young age, the urge of life was always towards individual development. And this became most obvious to her in an atmosphere of freedom. Now, she wasn't talking about freedom as abandonment, but rather freedom as a grounding principle, one that honors and allows the child's need to construct him or herself. The kind and amount of freedom varies and expands with each stage of development, but at all levels, individual freedom must take into account respect for others and for the environment. Montessori termed this freedom within limits, for it is within the limits of individuals working in harmony and cooperation that such qualities as patience, respect, empathy, order, and spontaneous as opposed to imposed discipline are formed. For her, finding the balance between personal independence and respect for the group was the base upon which the social being was formed. Now, Krishnamurti, like Montessori, really didn't view freedom in education as license or self-gratification. Both accepted that consideration and respect for others must always go hand in hand with the freedom. These are the underpinnings of peaceful relationships. Independence, self-understanding, and self-confidence are the outcomes of freedom in the context of education. And both would agree that true cooperation, happiness, and peace are the rewards of freedom in education. Krishnamurti suggests in many of his talks and dialogues that there's another kind of freedom to which schools and teachers should pay greater attention, namely the freedom from fear. Fear is one of the many motives employed by educators in traditional school settings and by parents to encourage children. Examinations, grades, competition and comparison, rewards and punishment, all these condition students to fear. Fear of failing, fear of displeasing parents or teachers, fear of being outdone by a peer. These all create an environment that encourages secrecy, dishonesty, competitiveness, and animosity. In Krishnamurti's version of what he called new education, schools have to become places where freedom from fear prevails. Because fear, he notes, and I think Montessori would agree, fear is one of the root causes of war and violence. Brotherhood cannot exist where there is fear, Krishnamurti warns. And Montessori also identifies these same kinds of ills about not creating an environment that limits the fear factor, if you like. But she also identifies the ills caused by the misguided educational practices of grading and competition and comparison. But I think in this aspect, Krishnamurti has more to teach us. We have more to learn from his philosophy about ways in which educators can become more aware of the implications, the psychological implications of fear. I think it's very well known that fear affects a person physically, but do we pause long enough to look closely at the causes and consequences of our own fears and distrust and those beliefs that cause fear in ourselves? Can a teacher, not to mention a school's principal or director, avoid passing on these latent fears, oftentimes hidden in the subconscious, to the children or to the faculty with whom she or he directs? Krishnamurti points out that most of, if not all of us, are fearful, not just the children facing strict adults or failing grades. Most educated people in today's world have been trained to seek security in conformity, to accept regeneration and imposed discipline. And under these circumstances, fear has really become ingrained in us. Now, as a model for an environment that is free from fear, I think we again have to turn to the work of Maria Montessori. The ungraded groupings of children by developmental as opposed to chronological age. In a Montessori school, the children are grouped 3 to 6-year-olds, 6 to 9-year-olds, 9 to 12-year-olds, and so forth, following their growth and development rather than their chronological age. And this, coupled with her insight that the individual finds satisfaction from freely chosen, meaningful work, makes praise, competition, comparison, and judgment, those other sources of fear, in the classroom superfluous. Her educational philosophy offers to education the gift of what she referred to as the prepared environment at all levels of development. The prepared environment contributes to peace and understanding, thoughtfulness and consideration for others, what Krishnamurti would have termed right relationships. And they have the opportunity to be lived and experienced by the young people in the school setting, and particularly in the setting of the developmental rather than chronological groupings. The prepared environment is a place where fear is minimized, and thus human relationships have the possibility to flourish. It's a peaceful place that supports the child's doing things rightly, that is, peacefully. Nonetheless, the bottom line remains self-awareness and attention to every detail by the teacher of his or her own fears, thoughts, and actions at all times is crucial to allowing students to experience freedom from fear. No discussion regarding freedom can be complete without pausing to give some attention to its antithesis, namely discipline. And to ask, is there any place for a discipline in a discussion regarding education and peace? Again, I find similarities in the work of Krishnamurti and Maria Montessori, in that both agree that freedom is not license, and if this is the case, surely freedom must embody some limits. Krishnamurti stated that, quote, freedom can never come through discipline, close quote. And I love this. He once told a group of students that he didn't like to use the word discipline, because of its implied meanings of conformity, fear, and obedience to authority. But he went on, this is in one of his talks to students, it was absolutely necessary for each one of them to be considerate of the needs of others, to be thoughtful, to be punctual, going to class and so forth, and in class to be attentive. And it was the self-discovery of what it is to behave in this way, to be kind, generous, thoughtful, and considerate, that is discipline, he said. And it is this form of discipline of the self that results in order, out of which comes freedom. When Montessori said, there is no freedom without discipline, she too was talking about self-discipline, and not discipline of the authoritarian dictates. As I mentioned, she called it freedom within limits, and it characterizes her approach to education at all levels. But the freedom requires respect for others and for the physical environment. And the order within the Montessori environment is what establishes the limits. Courtesy, thoughtfulness, harmony, and respect are nurtured in each individual according to what is appropriate at each stage of development, so that spontaneous self-discipline becomes a way of life, and being, or as she put it, spontaneous self-discipline emerges. I'd like to digress just slightly here to take a closer look at something very important that Krishnamurti has to teach us about stopping inappropriate behavior. I think this applies both to parents and to teachers. And his advice is that when inappropriate behavior occurs, that the teacher intervenes merely to negate it. An astute observer sees what is, and without judgment or condemnation, stops the offending behavior. It's acknowledging what is that brings about transformation in the immediate present. Now, it sounds very simple, but to negate the misbehavior is to see it and to deal with it, no more and no less. The lesson to the child is simply that this is something that should end, and the lesson or the message should be conveyed without tension, motive, or reward. There is no place here for conjecture. This is not the time to impose traditional values, to moralize or to capitalize on what we are often told is a teachable moment. To go further than stopping the behavior by getting involved in scolding, blaming, moralizing, and telling the child something that he should or should not have done, takes the focus away from what is in the immediate present and shifts the attention to a separate issue, which is, in effect, another lesson altogether. Now, Maria Montessori taught that young children in particular learn best if one difficulty is presented to them at a time or is isolated in some way. In this case, in the case of behavior, ending the misbehavior is the lesson. The stop it, what is. Frequently, again, what happens is, in this situation, the adult stops the inappropriate behavior and immediately begins a second lesson about what the misbehaving child ought, should not have done. And this immediately obscures the stop message by attending to the next time. Addressing looking into the future rather than staying in the present. The misbehavior, the inappropriate behavior, is how to deal with that is a separate lesson. And it ought to be presented to the child or shown to the child at a different time, away from and separate from the misbehavior. It might be given as a lesson in what Montessori called grace and courtesy to the young children. And this is always followed by practice, of course. For older children, group discussions and role-playing lend themselves to repetition and practice in how to relate, how to apologize, how to ask for something politely, how to perhaps negotiate for something. But if the children can practice, or the students can practice do that separately from the misbehavior, that's a separate lesson. And allowing them to practice it means that they can experience the lesson, so to speak. So the how-to is introduced in isolation, separate from the bad or misbehavior. It doesn't condemn or punish or shame a person or the individual who has caused some infraction. It shows all the children instead how to deal with inappropriate behavior in an appropriate and peaceful way. I'm going to just stop here for a second or two and invite you to think on these things for a moment, and then I'll wind up a little bit talking about the individual and society. But just maybe take a moment of silence. I don't know if we can do this if it's being streamed, but we'll try it. And if you would like to talk to the person next to you, that's fine, but just to think on these things for a moment. So to continue, I would like to look briefly at the topic of the individual and society, because whenever Krishnamurti and Montessori are discussing educational practice, development of the individual, again, is seen by both as one of the keys to revolutionizing education and bringing about social transformation. Krishnamurti notes that it is the individual who is capable of changing himself, and subsequently the individual who is responsible to himself and to act upon society. Montessori perceives the individual as being at the center of education and as a fundamental building block of society. Both, however, go on to explain that the individual cannot function in isolation, but only in relationship. Society is the product of our relationships to one another, and there cannot be a real society unless it is formed by individuals. Relationship, therefore, is about cooperation, respect, harmony, and order. And I think that Krishnamurti would agree with Montessori when she says that what she called a society of cohesion cannot be brought about through commands or teaching, but only through individual development and the right kind of education. The individual human being is, for Krishnamurti, as well as for Montessori, the agent of change. Therefore, education of the individual must include a social component that will foster relationship. Society is an association of individuals, and society cannot develop unless the individual does. A person cannot mature outside of society or without a social life. And finding a balance between personal independence and respect for the group is the base upon which the social being is formed. Social life experiences are the building blocks of self-control and morality. The cultivation of this relationship between the individual and society is a crucial constituent of education relative to peace. An understanding of relationships reinforces cooperation, compassion, love, happiness, and respect, all of which are basic to a peaceful society. And these must be experienced and lived in the social milieu. The school's purpose then is to develop the whole person so that he or she can meet life in society intelligently. And for social transformation to occur, as Krishnamurti noted, quote, there is hope only in the integrated individual, close quote. To which Montessori might have added that the child, the individual, is the instrument of transformation. The adult in this environment must respect all human life, for it is the loving, respectful teacher who elicits and cultivates right relationships both between individuals and between the individual and society. And healthy human relationships are the foundations of harmony and peace, and when practiced, reach well beyond the schools and the classrooms where they have been nurtured. It is the young people, the students of today, who will take their love and respect for humanity into their lives and into society. It was they who will have the potential to create a new world. The right relationship between the student and the teacher is yet another component common to the philosophies of Krishnamurti and Montessori. Understanding our relationships to others at any level is crucial in creating a peaceful environment. Without love, trust, and respect in the student and vice versa, the adult will have difficulty in creating the environment necessary for students to experience peace. Both Krishnamurti and Montessori point out that the role of the teacher is not one of authority over, but rather one of relationship with the student. Where Krishnamurti states that, quote, the right kind of education has no authority, close quote, Montessori expresses the same point when she says that it is important for the child to be free of adult influence. Both recommend such cautions to teachers as to listen, to observe, and to guide and awaken and help the development of the individual. Each is clear that it is necessary to create a learning environment in which obstacles to development are removed and in which freedom from fear, punishment, and reward are absent. And while Maria Montessori concentrates on the teachers making the match between the student and the student's developmental needs, Krishnamurti emphasizes the necessity of understanding the student without trying to mold him or her into conformity with the dictates of society. In this type of relationship, in this type of environment, the relationship between the teacher and the student is one of mutual respect and mutual benefit. It models peace. It is the adults in the children's world who must create this environment that will allow the children to become integrated individuals. And we come back to the beginning again. We have to begin with our own transformation if we're to be effective in bringing about a new form of education. The person who transforms him or herself will best be able to convey a new approach to life and to relationship through education. And since each one of us is society, by changing ourselves, we alter the nature of that society by an individual notch. A person who sees and understands his or her conditioning is free to open up and to allow development to unfold in others. That person is free to watch, to guide, and to nurture each student without conditioning anyone. The new child of this approach to education is an individual who is free and intelligent, compassionate and resourceful, amongst other things. And all of these are the hoped for results of a Krishnamurti or a Montessori education. Finally, conditioning and peace. Krishnamurti repeatedly told his audiences, it's not difficult to recognize and to look at your own conditioning. It only becomes so when you try to achieve a result. Consequently, he urged his listeners to avoid self-judgment and condemnation, but just to watch the self with compassion. He recommended being in the moment, not in the future, trying to become, to change, to give up, or to replace, but watching, quote, from moment to moment, the ways of one's thoughts, feelings, and actions. For in so doing, one will see the truth and find peace. I think that's harder than he thought it was. Peace results from compassion and thoughtfulness. It's achieved when you realize that the causes of war lie within you, in your class consciousness, your nationalism, your religious beliefs, your petty jealousies and envy. We talk of love, peace, and brotherhood, while at the same time despising others, judging and hating other isms, beliefs, customs, and so forth. And if you're conflicted within yourself, you are not peaceful. The difficulty for many of us is that we pursue peace, but we live in a society that cultivates forms of division and separateness that can become the causes of war. We want happiness and freedom, but we indulge in ill will and thoughtlessness. We seek understanding, yet deny it in our own lives. These numerous opposites in our own way of life provoke confusion and misery. Peace must begin with the individual who frees his or her heart and mind from violence, strife, judgment, and antagonism. One has to eradicate the causes of vice in the self and in the here and now. I might mention that Maria Montessori said many of the same things when she addressed the International Office of Education in Geneva in 1932. She noted that, quote, that men, quote, and I must come back to this just very briefly, Montessori used men and he throughout her work, and Krishnamurti tends to do the same thing. It's not politically correct in our society today, but I try not to slip into it, but having read a lot of Krishnamurti and Montessori, I tend to say he and men. In this case, Montessori noted that men have not been prepared to seek truth and to make it an intimate part of their lives. For her, the search for truth results in charity and compassion, words I think that are very similar to Krishnamurti's compassion and thoughtfulness. Montessori also argued that the causes of conflict were to be found in the human being's subconscious, again, in man, quote, not in armaments. Furthermore, she would agree with Krishnamurti that blame and moral indignation serve little purpose other than to lead to ethical chaos. Krishnamurti explores the search for truth and what is real, probably a lot more widely than does Montessori. He delves deeply into the way of truth, love, and understanding, suggesting that understanding the activity of your mind is the beginning of peace. You and I, we who are society, he says, are the causes of war. If we're conflicted, we project this outwardly. We project outwardly our inward conflicts. The person who is greedy, power-hungry, angry or an unquestioning believer holds any or all of these feelings inwardly and, as a unit of society, projects these, again in quotes, flaws outwardly. Krishnamurti's philosophical insight invites a multifaceted consideration of self-awareness by identifying not just the obvious defects like violence or nationalism that lead to war, but the little things like envy, ambition, greed, hate, and worldliness that we often overlook or that we're even unaware of in the subconscious, that make us dictatorial in the classroom and judgmental in the face of uncertainty. All these things have the potential to lead to conflict and, in the long run, to escalate into violence. It's all too easy to blame the other and to ignore these behaviors in ourselves. So what is really meant by peace? What causes war? And do we really totally want peace at all levels? There are lots of answers to these questions, and almost everyone will have a theory or a solution. And while some may blame the other for causing war or conflict, others will counteract by supporting organizations that promote, say, peace and humanitarianism. But while blame and attempts at reorganization may promote change, they are more likely to usher in another ideology or another belief that may postpone hostility but doesn't eradicate it, doesn't change it. Peace is not the denial of war, says Krishnamurti. Peace is a state of being in which all conflicts and all problems have ceased. Close quote. Is it possible to get to this place? And again, quoting Krishnamurti, he who is eager to reform the world must first understand himself, for he is the world. Freeing ourselves from the causes of conflict in relationships that can become magnified in war requires fundamental change in each of us. It comes about when we discover within ourselves, by ourselves, what is real. Self-discovery is direct experience, and as educators, we should be well aware that discovery and experience are the cornerstones of meaningful learning in all disciplines and at all levels of learning. By becoming aware of the content of one's consciousness, a person may not be able to prevent war or conflict, but one can recognize and bring about an inner revolution of values in which, quote again from Krishnamurti, you can free your heart and mind from violence and the causes that bring about enmity and prevent love. Inward conflict is projected outwardly, so understand this process of inward conflict. Be in touch with the problem to see truth. Understand that you're neither a warmonger nor a pacifist, a Jew nor a Buddhist. You're a human being at peace with yourself and consequently at peace with the world. Being at peace inwardly, you will project peacefulness outwardly. Can we help the students and children with whom we come in contact to get to this place? Peace and happiness are not to be taken for granted. They come at a price. And again, to quote Krishnamurti, the price of the clear intention to have peace in ourselves and to live in peace with our neighbors. The intention is essential. Thank you. I'm not very good at fielding questions. I have not mastered the art of dialogue. But if you do have questions, I footnoted all the quotations and so forth, so I can actually give you the references for where to find these different things. But if you do have questions, I'd certainly be happy to answer them. And my husband, who's better at dialoguing than I am, is sitting over there, and if I get stuck, I'll pass it on to him.
If you have any questions, James will come to the mic.
have one question and one quick comment. The series, The 1 Minute Manager, The 1 Minute Teacher, that came out in the 70s and 80s, were quite popular. And their idea was to just, in 1 minute, that's all your interference is with the child doing something wrong. And that kind of says what you're saying, too. And then my question is kind of historical. I was thinking Montessori and Mussolini, and what was her reaction to his regime, and what was, you know, what was the outcome of that?
Well, she was an Italian national, and when Mussolini came to power in Italy, he closed all the Montessori schools. And she went to, I think, I kind of sequenced it, and then she went to Spain, and she started her work in Spain, and then she got driven out of Spain. She ended up in Holland, and established a fairly a large movement. It acquired quite a following there. And then the Arundels invited her to come to India to give a lecture and a course in the training. And she went from Holland to India. But as far as Mussolini, she was completely closed out, so to speak, literally. He closed down all the Montessori schools.
May I ask, did you see any difference in the students graduate from your school and the students from like public school? That's what the big difference that you see.
Montessori was regenerated in the United States in the 1960s, early 1960s. For a long time, Montessori schools were primarily preschool age, addressing, you know, the preschool ages. Gradually, more schools were established for the lower elementary, upper elementary, and now are going all the way through high school. So it's really fairly recently that people have begun to be able to do testing, you know, scientific, psychological testing on the outcomes of a Montessori education and have a control group and so forth. But I think that there is general consensus that resourcefulness, what would you say, again, self-confidence and the ability to think and act independently are characteristics of Montessori education that seem to stand out. But as I said, there are relatively few, mostly it's anecdotal evidence up to now, within maybe the last 20 years. There is a woman named Angelina Lillard who has done some very interesting studies on the outcomes of Montessori education. What I have seen personally, since we only ran basically a preschool program at our school. We did not, for a few years we did an elementary program, but essentially ours was exclusively a preschool program going through the kindergarten class, but not beyond it. And so the impact that we had, I think, the students that I know who went through our program, again, they have these characteristics of being independent, being self-directed. There seems to be a great interest in again, just anecdotally, in performance kinds of activities, in theater and music, and I think those kinds of activities require self-confidence. So, Dar, do you have anything to?
They tend to be pleasing to their parents and other teachers because they own the responsibility and they're self-directed and they see learning as enjoyable, not as an obligation or something to do. And so their attitude is positive. And I think that comes from the nonviolent, peaceful environment that they experience. And one of the reasons, if I might add, that we stayed at the 3 to 6 year, because what you learn at that time, as you can recall, if you're learning to ride a bicycle, for example, at 4 or 5, you never forget. It becomes part of your, what we used to refer to as motor memory. And therefore, we thought we'd have the most impact on children by being in their most sensitive period and giving them the right, giving them a good start.
Providing right education.
There's many ways to do that, but I think that was a good decision. My gentleman who's sitting next to me says he's teaching in high school. Well, it's very hard to start from square one in high school. You know, when you start with a child at 2, you're starting at square one. So you get the best of all possible worlds.
You have to create, the school have to create an environment, right? So the teachers are the critical people as the environment. So do you have, so what's the way that you train the teachers, or what the difference of the teachers in your school and the teachers in other schools that they can create such a safe environment?
Well, I would say briefly and very quickly, one of the major differences in preparing the environment is the ungraded class. So instead of having, I'm teaching 4th graders, they're all 9 years old, all right? And here's the curriculum, and this is what they're going to learn in 4th grade, all right? In a Montessori environment, you're preparing an environment for, say, 1st to 3rd graders or 4th to 6th graders in the same room, okay? And so the one-room schoolhouse was an American example of that kind of environment. And in that environment, the children have opportunities to learn from one another, and they have opportunities to for example, if in my case, I wasn't in this kind of a school, but I couldn't read till I was 8 or 8.5 years old. I just one of these people that stumbled over the see Dick or Jane run, But in an ungraded environment, a child who can't read very well, even if he's older, sees people, the 8-year-old sees a 6-year-old who is learning to read and learns to read too, without feeling less than perfect, or having to be sent to a special, what they call it in the public school, So I think preparing the environment and having that environment is unique to the Montessori approach, and one of the ways in which you can, that makes it very different. There is specific training for Montessori educators too, and that knowing how to use the equipment that she designed, how to apply the approach to integrate your individual lessons with your group lessons and so forth. There is training for some of that, but I think really the preparation of the environment is very important, and I think the ungraded environment allows for growth and development of the individual without fear.
Thank you.
I enjoyed your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was just looking to see, at the beginning you said the Montessori schools have grown into many, many, many schools, and I noticed Krishnamurti schools haven't grown to that many. What do you think the growth that Montessori schools have relative to the Krishnamurti schools have? What is it that made them grow, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I don't know that I can answer that. Montessori came to the United States in between 1915 and 1920. She came at least twice, if not 3 times. She toured the whole country. She talked to large audiences in New York, Washington, San Francisco, and expounded on her experience with young children and the preparation of what she called the children's house. as opposed to the school. At that time, it did not catch on for various reasons, one of which was that Thomas Dewey and a man named Kilpatrick, who were very influential in public education in the 1920s, I don't know, were more influential, and so the Montessori movement did not take off then. I think in America in the 1960s was a very dynamic age. And I think there were a lot of revolutionary changes, shifts, even paradigm shifts in the 1960s. I think in the 1960s, young parents, or parents of young children, were interested in alternative education. And I think Montessori was a form of alternative education that for whatever reason, was acceptable to people, and people wanted to have it for their children. So I think there was a lot of impetus for it to grow here in the United States. Now, I was trained in Dublin, in Ireland, in 1962, and there were 11 students in my class, and they didn't take any more students because they didn't have jobs for them. Even though Montessori was a European phenomenon, it was very, very limited. And the year that I graduated in 1962, there were 11 people in my class. The director of training had 200 letters from people all over the United States. Can you send us a teacher? Do you have any teachers available? And as a result of the growth and development in the United States, it, for some reason, has affected the whole world. America does affect the whole world, one way or another, for good or for bad, at this stage in our history, you know. So there are, but other than the fact that it was the 1960s and that there was tremendous interest in alternative education and a lot of other things as well, I don't know that I can explain it. And I don't know enough, maybe Karen or Larry can help me with this, about the development of Krishnamurti schools myself to be able to say why, you know, they didn't have the same impact. I don't know at this point.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
I'm interested in why these various very good programs, yours, this is Montessori and Krishnamurti, why they weren't picked up by public education, because they're very sorely needed.
My response would be there's what would I say, too much emphasis on the individual. In order to approach a child as an individual, you can't approach the whole of society. You can only approach each person one at a time. And I think that you know, a public or a statewide system, is not geared to deal with that. There are, in the United States, there are magnet schools and public schools that have adopted Montessori. Milwaukee would be a very good example of, there are, I think, 3 whole public schools that are Montessori schools all the way through at least middle, if not high school. But I think to work with children as individuals is, you need to have a kind of commitment and a kind of energy as a teacher that is very, very demanding. And I don't know that you can
I'm also wondering if the textbook industry might have influenced that in some way.
I really don't know.
It's my personal opinion.
Our granddaughter just turned 5. She's in a Montessori school in Scottsdale, Arizona. She's a high-spirited child, and we are simply amazed at the way they have channeled her energy in such a positive way. She's mature, she's happy, she's talented, and we visited the school, and here are 30 little children working quietly, getting along, and we're just very, very pleased. So that's a hurrah for Montessori.
I do think you see that. I think you see that. People will come, used to come to our school and sort of come in the door and say, "Where are the children?" You know, because everybody's engaged. And one of the keys from the Montessori perspective, and what I mentioned this in my presentation, is meaningful work. And I think that applies at all levels. I think this is one reason why I think that maybe adolescents are very difficult to deal with in school, because that period between sort of 12 and 15 is not the time of life when you want to be sitting looking at a book. You know, you want to be learning to drive and to use tools, and so I think that it's often difficult to approach older or adolescents, because the matching the children, matching the activity, the meaningful work is a key to, again, to learning and to exploration and discovery.
Thank you for that. Yeah, my question was about this ungrading system.
Mm-hmm.
Is the same also for older students, so for high school and middle school? Okay, so
Yes.
they are all together, like the 3 ages.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, and yeah, my next question, I don't know if for you or for someone from Oak Group, the Krishnamurti schools are also ungraded, or?
Karen?
The Krishnamurti schools are also ungraded? Like they don't have...
Ungraded.
Well, in their youth, in Oak Grove's youth, because the school's about 40-some years old now, things have shifted in various eras. I think currently the ungradedness is mostly through 2nd grade, preschool through 2nd grade. They have kind of a range of ages. But starting with about 8, they have pretty strict grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, and so on, currently.
Any other questions? Comments?
Yeah, I have a comment. Working in high school, and having the Montessori school be more applicable to the younger ages. Well, that's very unfortunate, obviously. And to educators either that work with older ages or have associates or colleagues that do, we certainly can't tolerate that insufficiency in the Montessori curriculum. We too want to bring peace into the classroom. But at the same time, as a professional in the public school system, you're obliged most directly to the curriculum that is provided to you.
Not only that, you're obliged to respect the creators of the curriculum. You yourself hold a degree of higher learning. The people that are developing the curriculum equally should be respected. So it isn't just simply a top-down enforcement, but it's a matter of mutual respect, integrity for the fluidity of the information that is provided in the curriculum. Now, as you described, it's very beautiful, paying attention to the individual student, paying attention to the individual talents and the pursuits that the student wants. Really, it falls afoul of that obligation to the curriculum. And a question or observation was posed from the floor regarding why this hasn't come into public schools. And I remember one of the remarks from a master teacher in my credential program that said, "You must understand, you're training these students for the workplace." I think that's one reason that the Montessori philosophy hasn't entered into the public school system. Because in the workplace, we aren't really motivated towards individuality. We aren't motivated towards thinking out of the box. We aren't motivated towards, creativity, etc. But to close that, if we are working with older students or have that opportunity at any time, we should be privy to what you've described as some of the intentions of Montessori schooling. And I think without professional training to do so, we've got to be inventive in the way that we can be representative of individuals that are in the pursuit of peace while not losing our teaching contract or something like that. But to be an example in the classroom in the ways that we can, I think supports Montessori schooling even without the professional training. Would you agree?
I would agree, yes. And I think that, that's part of my point, is that if we're peaceful, or if you are as a teacher, you can convey that, I think, to the students. If you're angry and, you're trying to ram the curriculum down their throats, you're not conveying that message. But I think as an individual, there's a lot that you can do. You can respect your students, and sometimes it's harder than at other times. And sometimes the curriculum or the principal or somebody is dictating to you something that doesn't permit you to be as respectful as you would like to be. But again, my closing quote, if the intention is there, it's the intention that's essential. And I think that's somewhere that you can have an impact. Thank you.
I want to say the meaningful work resonates with me because in our high schools, they took all the meaningful work out. They took, it's gone. Everything. Okay. Meaningful work, pulling a switch. All the high schools took out all the shops and home ec and even driver education. I live in Oakland, California. Very difficult to drive when they haven't given a parking ticket in 100 years or a moving violation and the kids drive crazy. The other thing I would say, meaningful work, I taught newcomer parents to Oakland, immigrants, and I found teaching recipes and what they did at home was the best way to teach English, teaching English.
Yes.
So I think meaningful work
because it's something that meant something to them.
In their life, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But I think meaningful work was a great phrase, and I appreciate that.
Thank you. It's probably about time to quit. So I thank you all for listening and for your comments, and I'll be happy to talk with you. I'll be here through tomorrow, so there's plenty of time for more conversations. Thank you.